Hello everyone, this is Dominic, and today we're just going to talk about UV unwrapping. And so this is kind of a comprehensive guide that you guys can kind of go into. However, UV unwrapping is a very important part of our animation production pipeline, in which once we have finished modeling an asset, such as these headphones that I've made right here, we still have to go through and UV unwrap our model, so that ways we can effectively paint and texture them to look like plastic or metal or any of the materials that it's supposed to look like, or any of the colors that it's supposed to look like, without it just having to look like a gray blob like it is now. So the way UV unwrapping works kind of fundamentally is we have 3D objects. In this case, I've got a bunch of little objects in here that kind of assemble into this headphones that I need to basically unwrap or unroll or flatten out into a 2D tile. That 2D tile is very important because as I'm going to be texturing, what I'm going to be doing is basically applying colors or paints or images, onto this tile, 2D image to 2D image, that will basically project it onto all of the surfaces, on all of the different angles of my 3D object, therefore giving me the real estate that I can put details and all of the little things that I need to do for look development. So it's very important that I get all of these parts flattened down and organized and unified on my UV tile in order for me to go into texturing. So you have to do this for every asset, for each part that you make, whenever you are expecting to bring these into look development and texture them. So without getting further ahead, let's go ahead and figure out where we find all of our UV unwrapping tools. And so in our UI, we can look at the very top where it says UV up here on this tab, and the very first option right here is called the UV editor. And once I click on that, it opens the UV editor. And the UV editor is a window, it's a standalone window, but I can zoom in and out in this central space right here, and I can see this square, which is going to be my UV tile. So I'm going to want my 3D model, or the UV tiles that are in my 3D model, to all be laid out right here. So all of my UV shells are going to be in this UV tile. There are multiple tiles that you could potentially use. However, it's going to be a more complex topic that we'll talk about, known as UDIMs, and that'll have to be covered in another video. But for now, we're just going to be working with one UV tile. So basically, my look development artist, or me in the future, I'm going to be painting an image that is going to be a square, and that will be projected onto all of the UV shells inside this UV tile. So let's go ahead and get started. The way I like to do it is I like to go from one kind of group or one object at a time. So I'm going to hide some of these guys, and I'm just going to select this kind of group right here in my outliner, and I can see all of these guys right here. Now these are all of the UV shells shown without me having touched them, so they look very atrocious, and as you can see there's red, and red is not very good, but we're going to get rid of that in just a little bit. So the way I like to work is I like to work kind of up to down, so we'll just start with some of the very simple pieces right here. So this guy doesn't look so bad, but let me start off by saying, in my UV editor, I can see that my tile has this checkerboarding pattern. It says UV or U1V1, that's the name of the tile. But what's very important is this gray and white checkerboard. And as you can see, that checkerboard is also displayed or projected onto this UV shell because I have this object selected. So in this case, with this object selected, it'll show all of the UV shells that are going into it, which in my case, since I haven't touched it, is just one. But you'll notice in the three-dimensional space, this checkerboard is a little bit warped. You can see it's kind of like long and slender right here. These are more rectangular than squares, and what I want to happen is for these to look as square shaped as possible, or as uniform as possible on my 3D object, just as it shows on my 2D tile. So the way I like to start everything off is I can go to edge mode up here, and I can select all of these edges, and I can sew them together. And what is sewing? So the way that this works is, if we imagine this 3D form getting split up and flattened or unrolled or unwrapped, kind of like a cardboard box that's really just a big sheet of cardboard, the way I like to describe it is kind of like clothing. So the t-shirts or the jackets or the pants that we wear, they're three-dimensional, they go over our three-dimensional forms. However, they're made out of sheets of flat textile, whether that's cotton, linen, denim, things like that, but they're all flat. And so we've cut them in particular shapes or shells, and then we sew them together in a way that when wrapped into a 3D form, everything looks uniform and there's no warping and things like that. That's exactly the principle that we're going to apply here. So first things first, I'm going to, as I said before, sew everything together. So it's just one big bean bag. I can select this UV shell and I can move it around. It doesn't look, it looks quite worse than how it did before. But what I can do is I can start alleviating some of the pressure that's going on right here. So let's go ahead and talk about unwrapping. So unwrapping is a command that you can use in Maya, and the way to do that is by hitting Control U. And so if I hit Control U while my cursor is in the UV editor, as you can see, it unwraps into kind of this circular shape, and it's not too bad. We're very close to getting this thing to looking very, very uniform. However, as you can see, this part's starting to bend a little bit, and that's because when this gets pressed flat, it's almost like a big boot is stomping this flat. This part is going to crinkle up and warp, and that's exactly what we have going on. So maybe if I cut, and you can see my selection right there, if I cut this edge, then that will kind of help alleviate some of that pressure and flatten out. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to select this edge, hover my cursor in the UV editor, and hit Shift X. So remember, sew was Shift S, and cut is Shift X. And now, if I select the shell again and hit Control U to unwrap, you can see this part has opened up, and that's looking pretty nice. So if I turn this on, now this is looking a little bit better. Since this is a circle, I could do this on the other four corners that I've got right here. So I'm going to select those other three edges, hit Shift X to cut, and then select the entire shell and hit Control U to unwrap. And now that's looking much better. These guys are feeling much more flat. It still has a little bit of warping, but it's much better than how it was before, and I think we can call it a day on this guy. So I'm going to hide it, and we're just going to move down the line and figure out through some of these objects just how to unwrap these guys. So same thing that I always do. Let's select all of these edges and sew it into a nice big bean bag. And I'm going to look for angles, or kind of the border in which it's turning from, let's say this facing plane to this facing plane. These are two different angles, right? I'm going to start with those guys because I'm noticing that change in angle, and cut it to where now this, if I unwrap, kind of makes this fisheye shape, and this, if I unwrap, kind of makes, kind of this almond shape. Now, this almond shape still has some warping, and so what I think I'm going to have to do is probably cut a line down the middle, so it's almost like a roll of toilet paper. This is kind of rolled up, and if I cut it from top to bottom, or from this side to this side, I can now unroll it flat, as if you're just rolling tape, a roll of tape or toilet paper across the floor. So let's do that. Let's cut that there, and maybe for good measure I'll cut it on the other side too, here and here. We'll hit Shift X, and now since I cut it on both sides, these are now two UV shells, and if I hit Control U on both of them, they flatten out and they look quite a bit better on this side. It's looking very uniform right there. So this guy's looking pretty good. We'll call it, and we'll keep moving on for the sake of time. Let's see, I've got this wire right here, kind of built on the same premise that we talked about from that last object. I can just sew all of these parts together, and I'm going to choose the inside of this wire. So the part that you don't see too well, because you'll still notice the seam a little bit. So if I hide that seam and the inside where not many people are looking at the asset, then that might be a better place for it. But I can, of course, Shift X to cut, and then Control U to unwrap, and that's looking so much better. There we go. So that's done, and we're just going to continue moving down from here. So this guy is going to be a little bit finicky, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew everything together. I can immediately single out this tube right here because we just talked about cutting these as tubes. So let's go ahead and do that. So I can select this UV shell right here, and hit Control U, and that unwraps just the way we need it to be. Now this is kind of funky. This is like 2 discs. So what I've got a couple of options. One is I can cut this right here where they start shifting over, and that will create for me 2 discs. Obviously this one has a hole in it because that's where that cylinder connects to, but this one does not. Something else I can do is, for the sake of just keeping myself a little bit better organized, instead of having 3 UV shells, I can actually combine these to be 2 UV shells by sewing just this one edge right here. So instead of having it cut the entire edge loop, I'm going to have it cut all except for this guy, and this guy will be sewn. And now if I hit Control U again, I've got just one UV shell that fulfills this whole piece, which is kind of nice. So that guy's done. We can move on. A suspension clip is right here. This top part, that's a tube. Let's go ahead and sew everything before we start. Shift S. Let's come through here. I'm going to cut it just about right there. And what I'm going to do is, since this is the same on this left side and this right side, I'm just going to select this middle line that runs down there and hit Shift X. And now, if I select all of these, I can hit Control U and everything is unwrapped. And then for the sake of optimizing it, notice how these two are 2 different shells, but what I can do is I can grab that edge loop right there and up here, double click so it selects all of the edges in between, and I can hit Shift S over here in the editor, and then now I can Control U, unwrap it. Now I've just got one piece right here, which is nice, instead of 2. If I really wanted to, I can select this edge down here. Well, I can select this edge down here as well, and maybe just end it right about here. Sew it, and just like that part above it, I can hit Control U, and now this whole thing is just one piece, which is kind of nice. And it's feeling pretty uniform. I can get away with a lot of this. And if there's a seam there, that's okay, because that's facing the inside, and I'm not too worried about that. Let's move on to the speaker. This guy, well, that's very easy. This whole thing is just one big plane. So I can just sew everything together, hit Control U, done. Moving on. Hide, Shift H to unhide. This guy we just did, but there's like 4 of them, so we'll rinse and repeat. This might get repetitive, and if it does, I apologize about that, but we're just going to keep moving forward. So let's go ahead and sew that guy together. Select both of these, Control U, done. All right, almost done. We've got this cylinder portion right here. Let's go ahead and sew everything together, Shift S. I'm going to cut this inner kind of part out because that looks like a tube to me, so I can probably cut this from right here, 1, 2, and maybe on the bottom as well, why not? So now I've got 2 different half moons right here. I can select them both, hit Control U, now I've got those 2 halves and they're looking pretty nice. This part, if I hit Control U, that helps give me a better idea of where I need to cut. So there's some warping here, so I'm going to treat this outer portion right here because it's facing a different angle than this front facing side. I'm going to cut it right there at that border, and then just like the inside, we're going to split 1, 2, and 1, 2, 3. There we go. Shift X, and now same thing, 2 half moons, Control U, unwrap. These guys are looking a lot nicer now. All right, that guy's done. Let's go on to this final battery tray. This guy's going to be pretty fun to do, so this will be kind of nice. So this is kind of like a very funky rectangular prism, or like a kind of a long wonky cube. So I'm going to sew everything together. It looks pretty atrocious right now, but if I hit Control U, it shows me that this guy won't take much to really get a nice uniform unwrapping. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to find these 90-degree angles, which are defined by these edges right here. So these two edges kind of make that 90 degree. I'm going to select those, and I'm going to cut. And now, if I just unwrap it right now, you can see that it's opened up right here. Instead of looking like this on this side, it's opened up like so. And that really helps out kind of relieving that tension right here. So there's not the warping that you'll normally see. So let's do that on all four kind of sides or corners. We'll select that guy, and I'm going to hit cut, and maybe this one and this one, Shift X, and finally this one and this one, Shift X. And now if I unwrap all of it, it kind of opens up almost like a cardboard box. It's so satisfying. All right, almost done. Suspension clip. This guy, we've done it before, but of course we've got two of them in terms of this cup, so let's just go ahead and do that real quick. Cut this guy at the bottom, cut this guy right here, but sew, just like last time, we'll sew that one piece, select all of it, Control U, that's looking pretty good. Alright, moving on. Oh, this guy was super easy, it's just a tube, so we'll sew everything. I'm going to find that edge in the middle, and I'm going to hit Control U to cut it. Done. And then finally, the most complex shape in here, we've got this funky looking form. So, just like always, we're going to select everything and sew it. Now it looks just very wacky, right? But I'm going to start separating out these kind of areas by the angles that they're making. So this part I can probably cut out, but I don't want it to cut into. If I turn this off, you can see I don't want it to cut into this divot. I want this divot to be its own portion of the UV shell. So if I select this here and reach over and double click the other side, Shift X to cut, now it has cut everything up to those points. And I'm just going to kind of repeat that and slowly kind of scissor my way through. There we go, until I have just this chunk out here that if I hit unwrap, it's going to look pretty nice. Look at that, nice and uniform. Same thing for, there's like a cup down here, so this guy is going to be very easy. If I just double click that edge loop, cut it out, that's good to go right there. And finally, for this one, I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to double click this kind of edge right here and this guy right here. We're just going to cut it, and what that's going to do is that's going to let this whole thing just kind of open up like a clamshell and straighten itself out. So that's feeling very nice. So once you have all of these dudes unwrapped, in this case in terms of this portion of the model, there's a couple of things that we need to do. A is we need to get them all to fit in this one UV tile, and it's not quite as simple as just shrinking it down and positioning it. In this case, we also do not want these guys to overlap, so we would need them to each have their own space, and they can't be on top of each other, kind of like this bumbled mess right here. So I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to notice that if I select all of these guys, some of the checkerboarding is at an angle and it's not going, up and down like how I'd want it to be. And also some of them are different sizes or different scales. So this guy has checkerboarding that's much bigger than this one, which has smaller checkerboarding. And so because of that, that's telling me that this guy right here is smaller and will have less detail than this guy over here. And so you want everything in your UV tile to be the same, the proper scale, in relation to each other. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these, and we need to assign them what we call a texel density. Texel density is a fancy word for scale in terms of UV manipulation and modifications. So the way we find that is in our UV toolkit, which is over here on the right. If you scroll down to the transform shelf right here, you can find texel density. And right now I've put in an arbitrary number. It doesn't quite matter what it is so long as you can fit everything in there. But I can hit set texel density, and now they are all set to the same identical scale, which is kind of nice. There we go. All right, but some of these are still at different angles, and so I need to fix that as well. So what I'm going to do is have all of these selected. I'm going to right click and hold, and I'm going to go down to modify, and I'm going to go to orient shells. We'll let go. And now, as you can see, that has kind of straightened up all of these guys to line up. Something that you might have to do is if you're noticing, let's say that number 1 is crooked sideways, I might have to use this button right here to rotate that to be a little bit better. Let's see, same thing right here. There we go. Yep. And so this part might take a little bit, but I won't get too carried away with it. That's upside down. So if I click that 4 times, that'll flip it over all the way nice and neat. And this guy is looking a little bit crooked. We're just going to turn it until it looks a little bit better. There we go. That one's upside down. Now the final thing is, of course, laying everything out. So in this case, for these headphones, as you can see, I have UV unwrapped all of these guys. And in order to fit them into one UV tile, I'm going to need a smaller scale than 33. So I'm going to select everything, and let's just set everything to 15, just to get everything to fit. So now something that I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Smart Layout command or tool in Maya. And the way you can do that is by right click and hold, go to modify and go to layout. However, before I let go and activate this command, I need to change some settings and parameters. So I'm going to click on or release on this box that's right here to the right of it. And when I do, I get this window. This shows the layout UV options. And the most important things I'm going to change are I'm going to turn off shell pre-rotation, make sure that's off, and then shell pre-scaling, make sure that's off as well. We don't want it to change the scale out of 15. We'll leave these guys alone, and we'll come down to scale mode and make sure that that is off as well. And once you've done all of those settings, you can hit apply. And now, as you can see, it has laid out all of these UVs, and they are all the same size. So if I select just one of these guys and hit get, it says 15. If I select this, hit get, it says 15. If I select everything and hit set, it doesn't change anything because they're all already at the same texel density, which is kind of nice. This isn't quite filling up the entire UV tile, so maybe I need to make these guys a little bit bigger. I really want them to be to fill up as much space as they can on the tile, so that way I can use as many pixels in my image as I can. So it looks like 17 might do the trick. And with all that being said, that is how we can UV unwrap our 3D models. So if I select everything right here, you should be able to see a really nice, pretty checkerboarding, just like that, looking great. So UV unwrapping, it takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of little stuff to kind of nitpick and go through, and take your time and make sure that you are paying attention to the orientation, to the scale, to making sure that none of these pieces overlap, and to making sure that none of these UV shells are deformed. We want to get everything to look as uniform as possible. That way we'll have the least number of problems when it comes to look development. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But until next time, we're going to dive into some more complex UV unwrapping. But hopefully this helps. I will catch you next time. Bye-bye.